Sound check, testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
We were used to a left and right sort of divide. And I was just reading an article in The Economist recently, that talked about how the world is no longer divided between left and right. That was 20th century. Today we're seeing a world divided by open and closed. And what I mean by that is, people advocating an open society, more interconnectedness, more integration, and those who advocate a closed society, isolationism, and so on. And we're seeing this happening all over the world. In the US, of course, the rise, the unlikely rise of Donald Trump, I think reflects the salience of this sort of isolationism, or as some people put it now, Americanism over globalism. But essentially the dynamics are that people see or are living in a system that they feel to be broken. But unfortunately, the argument from those who are more closed, who are advocating a closed society, essentially to build more walls, to kick out people who are different, because it's very easy to blame the others, people who are different. And this trend of xenophobia we see not just in America, it's happening in Europe as well. There are now ultra-nationalist governments in Hungary, in Poland, compared to the year 2000, which is about 16 years ago. Extreme left and extreme right parties now enjoy twice as much support in Europe. They are in government in 9 countries in Europe, either as a government on their own or as part of a coalition government. And obviously we all saw what happened last month with the Brexit, or 2 months back with the Brexit. Was it last month? June. And I think the Brexit really in Britain was the culmination of this anti-globalist movement. And not only did Britain leave the world's largest single market and trading bloc, it did so for completely misguided xenophobic reasons. You remember the news the day after, when basically the highest searched phrase on Google was, "What is the EU?" and what does it mean Britain leaves the EU? So essentially nobody knew what they were voting for. They all thought that by voting to leave the EU, they were voting to get rid of Muslims or immigrants and so on and so forth. So xenophobia seems to be the prevailing trend. And these same dynamics, I think, are also happening in the Islamic world. And obviously capitalized upon by extremists. So now we see this rising advocacy of the Neo-Caliphate, such as the Islamic State, which is intent on recreating sort of medieval Arabia. And obviously their solutions are similar to what people like Trump and other right-wing nationalists are saying. Cut the world, draw a line, separate everyone else. The solution lies in the past, and in doing so, obviously, make more enemies with everyone else. So it's very, and in the Islamic world, especially in the Middle East, also takes on a very narrow sectarian, or Sabia sort of approach. So now we see this rise of Islamo-fascism, great violence taking place daily in the Middle East through the Islamic State and others, but spreading also through the Muslim minorities in other countries in Europe, in the form of terror attacks, which we've seen recently in Germany, in France, and so on and so forth. Malaysia was also, according to our police, there was one attack in Puchong and no fatalities. But essentially, it's also really a vicious cycle. I think as we see tensions and fault lines becoming more and more pronounced and accentuated. Again, it's very easy to retreat into a shell. It's very easy to isolate yourself and then just blame others. But really, it's a vicious cycle, because the more you divide and the more you promote hate, sectarianism, actually it will just engender more violence, more hate, and more. So, more negativity. So So I think the solution obviously requires more openness, not less, more inclusiveness. And I think, yes, the modern world has many problems: globalization, urbanization, modernity, global trade. All these things create problems. But, you know, just because they create problems doesn't mean you shut the whole thing down. It just means we need to create solutions to these problems. We need bold policies. We need to look at, obviously, we need to counter the side effects. If global trade, for example, causes people to lose jobs, then perhaps we need to increase some social safety nets. So things like this, bold policies to counter this very rapidly changing world that we're in, instead of actually, building more walls, kicking people out, throwing people in jail, waging war, and just more violence. So, and the same thing, I think, if you look at the trends that's happening in Islam, I think there is a real need to address the root of resentment, of dissatisfaction. There needs to be more focus on education, on development, social mobility. We also need to recognize really that this problem of the ISIS or Islamic State is not just a Muslim problem or just a Western problem. It's a global problem. It's also a problem for Muslims. It's a problem for non-Muslims. It's a problem for humanity, and we need to face it as one, as united people. So I think obviously Dr. Hashemi would be able to elaborate on all these points and of course on the topic that we're here to discuss. I think we're all looking forward very much to the talk that we're about to hear. Once again, I'm very happy to actually see good attendance here. I don't know, maybe is it better parking? Because when we used to do it for Wawasan, it's always, you don't get parking, right? So here it's ample parking, and I hope that in the future we'll continue to have such good attendance in all our events. We do have a conference, and some of you may have received the email coming up this weekend, an international conference, but seats are very limited. I don't know if there are any left. You can inquire with our office. That would be also quite interesting. It would be our first major event in our new venue. So thank you very much. Of course, next up will be Dr. Hashemi. I believe the MC will introduce him. Dr. Hashemi, thank you very much for coming once again, and we're very honored to have you as the first speaker of the first Penang Institute event in our new hall. So thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Mr. Syarul Johari. So, just to give you guys heads up about the flow of event tonight. I'll be introducing the speaker, Dr. Nader Hashemi, and he'll be giving a lecture. Afterwards, will be followed by the Q&A sessions for the evening. So, without further ado, Dr. Nader Hashemi, our guest speaker for tonight, he is the director of the Middle East Studies at the University of Denver, and he is, well, I would say, a research expert on various areas such as political Islam, Iranian politics, of course Muslim democracy, Middle East conflicts, and also I believe you recently co-edited a volume on the Syrian crisis. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that too, because there seems to be a lot of concern about Malay Muslims here. And this is very recent. So his book, his major book, has just been translated into Malay actually, so it's our national language. Just launched last week, a few days ago, and it's called Islam, Secularism dan Demokrasi Liberal. In English, the title is Islam, Secularism and Liberal Democracy. So it's translated and published by the IRF. It's about 50-ish, I think. So if you'll be interested to popularize the discourse that he'll be bringing to us here tonight, just do get a copy and read out about his work. So without further ado, Dr. Nader Hashemi.
Okay, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to the organizers for your hard work in bringing me back to Malaysia for the second time. What I want to do this evening is to provide an analytical framework to understand the rise and expansion of ISIS. We're now into the second year of the ISIS crisis. Arguably, this is a topic that is at the top of the international and global agenda. Most predictions are that this crisis will remain a major international crisis for the coming years, and that poses an important challenge for us in terms of how can we explain the root causes of this particular crisis. How can we historically and politically explain this phenomenon, which captured the world's attention 2 summers ago when ISIS captured Iraq's second largest city, and despite 2 years of an attempt by the leading powers in the world to eradicate it, it has lost territory, but it still functions and it is still around, and it's anyone's guess when it might be defeated. And so the remarks that I'm making tonight is based on a long chapter that I've just written, and it's going to come out in an edited book. So if you're interested in the footnotes or the references, email me sometime and I can give you the text of my remarks. Okay, so what is the best framework of analysis to explain the rise of ISIS? Is the rise of ISIS fundamentally due to something inherent in Islam or in Arab culture or in Islamic political thought? Richard Haass, the distinguished president of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, has suggested that one of the problems with respect to this crisis in the Middle East is that this is a part of the world that still has been unable to come to terms with modernity. Is that what's going on here? In attempting to explain the ISIS crisis, President Obama has on several occasions sought to explain the rise and expansion of ISIS as a function of what he has called ancient sectarian hatreds between Sunni and Shia that is rooted in conflict that, quote, date back a millennium, sort of suggesting that what we are experiencing here in the Middle East is equivalent to the Christian wars of religion in the 16th or 17th century. There's not much that anyone can do to ameliorate these conflicts. They just have to burn themselves out. Or, more narrowly, is the ISIS crisis more fundamentally connected to the legacy of US intervention in Iraq, particularly after 2003? Did a failed US policy under President Bush inadvertently create the ISIS crisis, as some people have argued? I think there are elements of truth in all of those suggested options, but in my own analysis, as someone who spent most of my adult life understanding the politics of the Middle East, I fundamentally root the ISIS crisis in the intersection of 2 sets of developments that have been brewing and expanding in the region and now have converged to provide a set of social conditions in which the ISIS crisis can and should be understood. So, the first development that I think is absolutely essential in terms of understanding the ISIS crisis, and it has a much longer history, is a direct byproduct of the legacy of political authoritarianism in the Middle East. And the second development, which is more recent, is the predictable consequences that flow from state breakdown and state collapse. Let me speak about those 2 things. So the first one, with respect to political authoritarianism, this has been a key feature of the politics of the Middle East for a very long time. Survey data has consistently revealed that among the regions of the world that are the least democratic, the Arab Middle East has repeatedly topped the list. This is rooted in the colonial era and the rise of modern states, the institutional legacy of colonialism in the region that was bequeathed to the new states that emerged after independence, meant that the military, the police, and the bureaucracy emerged as the strongest institutions in the post-independence period. And these institutions and the ruling elites who controlled them were to significantly shape the politics of the Middle East and their own societies in subsequent decades, and not for the better. So authoritarian regimes, when we think about them, they're not monolithic, they're not all the same. There's considerable variation in terms of the nature of state-society relations and the extent of political tyranny of these regimes. At the extreme end of a spectrum of political tyranny, there are those regimes that the late Iqbal Ahmed has called neo-fascist. The survival of these regimes is dependent on widespread repression of political opposition and social institutions outside of the state control: religious, educational, professional associations, labor, and peasant organizations. In the 1960s and 70s, we witnessed, or there was a hardening of the institutional, there was a hardening of the authoritarian arteries of the state. There was a development of the systematization of terror by the state, and the modernization and rationalization of their repressive institutions. And as a result, one of the enduring characteristics of these extreme forms of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East that I'll call neo-fascist is that they were the most blatant, contemporary violators of human rights, both in substantive and in procedural terms. Now, Iqbal Ahmed, in describing this broad emergence of authoritarianism in the post-independence period, as these new post-colonial states were emerging, was describing them as being increasingly authoritarian as we head to the end of the 20th century. As we get to the late 20th century, the patterns of repressive rule of several of these states further intensified. Several of the worst forms of these neo-fascist regimes throughout the developing world were actually located in the Arab Islamic world. They were effectively national security states where the ruling elites viewed the state as absolute and the individual as unimportant. The armed forces were the most important institutions that controlled the country. And there existed in many of these states a vast set of political and intelligence institutions that permeated society. The highest officials of these repressive institutions were the rulers of the state. And if you were to compare the countries in the region in terms of their repressive rule, Iraq and Syria, under their respective Ba'ath parties, most closely approximate the worst forms of these neo-fascist regimes. So Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a human rights catastrophe. Upon seizing power, Hussein expanded the institutions of violence that ruled the country through a combination of lies, fears, assassinations, show trials, and a vast network of secret political and intelligence organizations. The Shia population suffered persecution, and minorities such as the Kurds were harshly repressed. When they resisted, they were subjected to what Human Rights Watch called a campaign of extermination that amounted to the crime of genocide. This is in reference to the Kurds. In 1990, Iraq ranked first in the world for the number of disappeared people. The UN characterized the human rights situation in Iraq in the 1990s as being of an exceptionally grave character, so grave that it had few parallels in the years that have passed since World War II. I'm quoting from the UN Human Rights Report. Syria suffered a same fate under the House of Assad. A comparison of the human rights record of the Arab League member states also places Syria at the extreme end of a spectrum of repression. Arguably, only Saddam Hussein's Iraq was worse. Most people, when people look into the question of human rights during the Assad family's rule, they are reminded of the 1982 massacre in Hama that reportedly killed approximately 20,000 people in 1 week after the Muslim Brotherhood staged an uprising. But that was only a small part of the human rights catastrophe that was unfolding under the Assad regime. There was also this vast and extensive prison system that developed. Tens of thousands of people have passed through its doors. Untold numbers have disappeared. In 1996, for example, Human Rights Watch published a report on the notorious Tadmor prison in Syria, where it describes deaths under torture and summary executions on a massive scale. One former inmate described the place as a kingdom of death and madness, and emaciated prisoners were compared to, quote, survivors of Nazi concentration camps. That's a quote from the Human Rights Watch report on the Syrian prison system of Tadmor. But this was just one prison system in a veritable torture archipelago. The full story of Syria's prison systems and its internal human rights nightmare under the Assad regime has yet to be properly told. But the horrors of Syria's prison system have grown exponentially since the 2011 Arab Spring uprising. About a year and a half ago, 55,000 photographs of torture victims were smuggled out of Syria by a military defector codenamed Caesar. These photographs were authenticated by Human Rights Watch, and they give us a glimpse of the human rights nightmare in Syria. As a recent UN report on prison conditions in Syria have documented, they charged the Syrian government with crimes against humanity that, quote, amounts to extermination. The key point here that has a bearing on the ISIS crisis is that this legacy of despotism, this legacy of tyranny, has destroyed the social fabric of Iraq and Syria. This process was set in motion long before the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, and long before the 2011 Arab uprising in Syria, both which simply exacerbated these trends of social decay that were already in process. The concept of social cohesion here, I think, is relevant. Social scientists have long recognized that stable political systems are rooted in a dense network of voluntary citizen associations that help to sustain civil society and community relations. This generates social capital and social trust and produces cooperation among citizens from diverse backgrounds. Over time, conditions are created that enhance social integration, cultivating ties that bind society together, thus promoting peace and internal stability over the long term. Now, the legacy of political authoritarianism in the Arab world has produced the exact opposite of these trends. Instead of social cohesion, there has been social disintegration. Instead of social trust, there is widespread fear and distrust of others. Suspicion of paid government informants who might be working for the state's many intelligence services is a normal part of political life. The, quote, walls have ears phenomenon is a common feature of these police states. In his newly published book, Anatomy of Authoritarianism of the Arab Republics, Joseph Sassoon documents this story. He observes that during the late 20th century, Arab authoritarian regimes created a climate of fear and distrust that permeated every corner of society. The mechanisms of controlling the masses were remarkably similar across these regimes, replete with arrests, torture, trials, liquidating opponents, inside and even outside of the country. The net result, after decade upon decade, of this form of harsh, authoritarian, veering into totalitarian rule was that it left a deep wound in these societies and created a sense of uncertainty that penetrated and deeply scarred the bulk of the population. Joseph Sassoon concludes that the suffering of the masses in these authoritarian regimes would produce effects that would have repercussions for decades to come. And one of these repercussions of the habituation of these patterns of social and political life is the subtle yet steady creation of a culture of fear that includes paranoia, conspiracy theories, and a desire to extract revenge. And when these societies are then subjected to a calamitous shock via war or state collapse, collective disorientation sets in, and the doors to radicalization are opened. Now let me transition to the second theme that I think is fundamentally connected to the ISIS crisis, and that is the consequences that flow from state breakdown and state collapse. So take Iraq, for example. For the last 37 years, Iraq has faced continuous and ongoing war in one form or another. Started in the year 1980. You had an 8-year brutal war with Iran that killed about 250,000 Iraqis, completely bankrupted the country. There was a brief interim period. Then you have Saddam Hussein's infamous invasion and occupation Kuwait, another war takes place. Iraq is further pulverized, and then you have these comprehensive American and Western-led sanctions on Iraq throughout the 1990s that deeply devastated and destroyed Iraqi civil society. All of the human development indicators in Iraq plummeted. Ironically, the regime was strengthened, and that brings us to 2003. And then you know the rest of the story. What has happened in Iraq since 2003? In Syria, you have a similar situation in terms of the predictable effects that flow from war and state collapse. The only difference is that in Syria, it's been happening for about the last 5 years, but the effects of the war in Syria, I would argue, are 1,000 times worse. So by the end of the first year of the Syrian uprising, in March of 2012, all of the leading human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Special Commission of Inquiry on Syria, charged the regime in Damascus with state-sanctioned war crimes and crimes against humanity. On the 3rd anniversary of the war, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon issued a global plea noting that Syria now is the biggest humanitarian and peace and security crisis facing the world. The moral and humanitarian catastrophe that has engulfed Syria since then has only gotten worse. On the 5th anniversary of the conflict, 2 new reports established that in 2015, this was the deadliest year of the Syrian conflict. According to conservative estimates, about 500,000 people have been killed, over 1 million have been wounded, and this figure reflects 6% of Syria's population. At least 60% of Syria's population now are displaced, about 5 million refugees in the surrounding countries, the rest internally displaced. The conflict in Syria has produced the world's worst refugee crisis of the 21st century. It has produced a chemical weapons crisis, an underreported rape crisis, a massive health crisis, an extensive torture crisis, and as a consequence of all of these crises, the conflict in Syria has also produced an ISIS crisis. And it is precisely and exactly because of these quasi-genocidal conditions that have created a fertile soil for the rebirth and the expansion of radical Islamic militancy. It is in this context that a group like ISIS has been able to emerge. So the key point here that I want to emphasize, and that it's worth pondering in terms of understanding the ISIS crisis, is why did ISIS establish its so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and nowhere else in the Islamic world? What is unique about Iraq and Syria that has allowed this group to establish itself there? And I think the uniqueness of these two countries is precisely what I just mentioned. Number one, the legacy of political tyranny and political authoritarianism in the post-colonial states of the Arab world were most directly, I think, felt in the context of Iraq and Syria, just in terms of the number of human rights violations, political prisoners, the nature of state-society relations. And the second thing that's unique about Iraq and Syria is the predictable consequences that flow from war and state collapse. In Iraq and in Syria, the states have collapsed. And it's a consequence of these two factors where there is an opening, there's a vacuum, and these radical groups have inserted themselves. But there's more to the story here. There's the question of the political legitimacy of the regimes in Damascus and in Baghdad. In the post-American invasion and occupation of Iraq, the political order that emerged there resulted in a situation where you had Shia political parties that came to power, and they ruled effectively in a way that was a reflection of a majoritarian Shia form of rule. They favored their own group. 60% of Iraq is Shia. They favored Shia political communities. Partly that is understandable given how much they were repressed under Saddam Hussein, but that had consequences because the 20% of Iraq that were Sunni felt alienated, felt discriminated when they protested, when they were angry, when they demanded representation, they weren't listened to. And then they were repressed, and then they were persecuted. And then some of them gave up and started to look to other groups for representation who could perhaps be a voice for Sunni grievances in Iraq. In Syria, you have a similar situation. You have one family that's been in power in Syria for the last 45 years. It's perceived to be an Alawite-dominated family that controls the country and favors its own group, and the vast majority of Syrians, 70% Sunni, feel alienated and discriminated against, and that's why you had an uprising in the context of the Arab Spring. And that's why this conflict continues. I want to say more about that. But those are the background conditions here in terms of trying to understand why Iraq and why Syria and what's so distinct about those two countries. Now, there's more to say about the conflict in Syria. All roads lead to Damascus, and what I mean by that is that you cannot understand the ISIS crisis unless you understand the internal conflict in Syria. These two things are intimately and deeply linked. As one US high-ranking general noted about a year ago, Syria is like a geopolitical Chernobyl. It is going to continue to spew radioactive instability and extremist ideology over the entire region until this conflict is brought to an end. Now, if you understand the history of ISIS, ISIS has its origins in the Sunni insurgency that emerged in Iraq after the American occupation. And you have an organization that emerges around 2004, which is an Al-Qaeda franchise in Iraq, headed by this guy called Musab al-Zarqawi, who was assassinated in 2006. But this is the origins of radical Sunni insurgency in this part of the world. And so you have an Al-Qaeda franchise that emerges in Iraq, and it starts to challenge the political order that was being set up. But as a result of the American surge, as a result of the attempt to buy off various Sunni tribes, the tide of the war against Al-Qaeda in Iraq starts to switch. And as you get to the year 2010, as you get to the year 2011, when American troops are about to pull out of Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the precursor of ISIS, is basically a defeated organization. They have no longer popular support because of their brutality. There's still a sense that the Sunni community is willing to give the government in Baghdad the benefit of the doubt. They haven't revolted yet. And most importantly, most of the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq is assassinated or they're arrested. So as the American troops are pulling out, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is a shadow of its former self. But at that moment, something else happens in the region that gives Al-Qaeda in Iraq a new lease on life. And that is the war in neighboring Syria. The Arab Spring comes to Syria in March of 2011, starts in Tunisia, sweeps across the Arab world, and you have a situation where you have an uprising. And in 2011, it's basically citizens, non-sectarian, challenging an authoritarian government, demanding democracy, dignity, and social justice. And the government in Damascus, backed by Iran, and increasingly backed by Russia, cracks down hard on the uprising. And thousands of people are mowed down in the streets. And the government in Damascus starts to lose support, it can no longer control the country, and you have a political vacuum that opens up. And it's in the context of this political vacuum, in the Arab Spring in Syria, that ISIS from Iraq slowly moves in across the border, establishes itself, and expands its influence. And over the course of the next few years, emerges as the most extensive and potent rebel group among the rebels that are fighting the Assad regime. That's the background. And that's why Syria is so important to the ISIS crisis. Because the vast majority of ISIS militants, the vast majority of ISIS's military hardware, the de facto capital of ISIS, are all located in Syria. So theoretically, you might be able to defeat ISIS in Iraq. The Iraqi army might be able to capture town after town as they're doing. They might be able to capture Mosul sometime in the next few months. But ISIS will simply move over into eastern Syria, and they're entrenched there. And there is no military force at this moment that can dislodge them. And it's pretty clear that bombing them from the sky has limited effect. And so that's why Syria is so central to the crisis, to the ISIS crisis. As the veteran journalist, Middle East journalist Robin Wright has accurately noted, Syria is the strategic center of the region. What happens there will affect everybody. And so the question of what to do about Syria has now paralyzed the international community. At the international level, the international community is divided. Russia has one vision, the United States and allies has one vision, the Security Council is paralyzed. Regionally, the region is divided. Iran and its allies on one side, Saudi Arabia and its allies on the other. And we have a situation where this conflict continues to bleed, continues to produce violence. As I speak, the city of Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, is basically under siege. 200,000 to 300,000 people are effectively under siege, and it's being bombarded day by day with massive loss of civilian life. And no one seems to want to do anything about it. And this is producing and expanding the social conditions of radicalism. And so until there can be a resolution of the internal conflict in Syria, there's no hope that the ISIS crisis can effectively be dealt with. There's a lot more to say on that. I'm just giving you a brief overview of why Syria is so central. But there's more things that have been happening in the region that are central to understanding the ISIS crisis. And that is something that I mentioned a moment ago, but I want to say a few more words about it. That is the question of the Arab Spring, or particularly the defeat and the rollback of the Arab Spring pro-democracy protests that began 5 years ago. Now, there's a long-standing and widely recognized relationship between democratic societies and violence. The more that democracy advances in the form of political accountability, public transparency, and the peaceful transfer of power, the less the likelihood of violence. This is a variation of the famous democratic peace theory that recognizes that democratic societies are more internally peaceful and less likely to go to war than their non-democratic counterparts. And this theory also pertains to the rise of ISIS. Observing the general pattern of politics in the Middle East today, it's often forgotten that 5 years ago, the region looked like it was headed in a much brighter direction. The 2011 Arab Spring protests were celebrated by most of the world as they began in Tunisia, sweeping 3 long-standing dictators from power and coming pretty close to toppling 2 more. The foundations of authoritarianism in the Middle East were deeply shaken by these pro-democracy protests. And what's so interesting is Al-Qaeda's response to the Arab Spring uprisings. Al-Qaeda was shocked by this turn of events, and it produced ideological confusion and organizational incoherency within the heart of the Salafi jihadist movement. In an important study called A Jihadi Discourse in the Wake of the Arab Spring, the authors note that during the Arab Spring, Al-Qaeda and its supporters were impotent and unpopular on a broad level. The reasons for this are self-evident. For a moment it appeared that political change could happen in the Arab world via peaceful protest rather than through violent revolution. And this undermined one of the central ideological claims of Al-Qaeda, which had long argued that dictators could only be removed via armed struggle, not democratic elections or nonviolent protests. As Ayman al-Zawahiri famously put it, quote, "What is truly regrettable is the rallying of thousands of duped Muslim youth in voter queues before ballot boxes, instead of lining them up in the fight for the cause of Allah. And as a result, the ideological appeal of Islamic militancy during the Arab Spring protests fell precipitously throughout the Islamic world. But the Arab Spring, of course, was rolled back, largely due to a counter-revolution led by the old previous ruling elites, the deep states that ran these societies, and their regional allies, primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that bankrolled the counter-revolutions. The promise of peaceful political change and the doors to democratization were firmly slammed shut. As a direct result, there has been an increase in violence and extremism across the region. This demonstrates another important relationship that is central to the politics of the Middle East. When democratic openings are closed and moderate forms of political Islam are crushed, radical Islam thrives as a consequence. In the case of Egypt in 2013, as a result of the military coup that took place there, perfectly illustrates this point. So you had a democratic process in Egypt that began after the toppling of Mubarak. It was messy, it was confusing, but it was on track. The military stages a coup d'etat in 2013. It topples the first democratically elected government, and it takes power in the summer of 2013 in an orgy of violence that was so brutal. 1,000 peaceful protesters were gunned down in the summer of 2013 in downtown Cairo. in an act that Human Rights Watch described as what may have been the worst single killing of protesters in modern history. And as a result of this military coup d'etat, Egypt has veered sharply but very firmly in the direction of massive violence. And so you see an upsurge in violence in Egypt after the toppling of the democratic process. So in the 22 months before the coup d'etat in 2013, there were reportedly about 70 acts of violence in Egypt. In the 22 months after the coup d'etat, there was 700 attacks of violence. And now there are 41,000 political prisoners, most of the Muslim Brotherhood, who have been tortured and continue to languish in prison. Now, the number of young people who've been radicalized in Egypt as a result of this turn of events is difficult to measure. But to the extent that there is anecdotal evidence, there's a lot of cause for concern. Egypt, I would argue today, is increasingly becoming a breeding ground for radical Islamism, and in that sense, General El-Sisi is perhaps the best recruiter radical Islamism could ever hope for. Professor Mark Lynch has argued that notwithstanding the Muslim Brotherhood's social conservatism, historically speaking, they performed an important role inside Egypt as, quote, a firewall against extremism. If you were a politically active Egyptian with a religious identity, you could find expression in the public sphere by joining the Muslim Brotherhood and participating in electoral politics. But since the coup d'etat in Egypt and the attempt to eradicate the Muslim Brotherhood, this option no longer exists. So if you're a young Egyptian today and you have a religious identity, you have two options. One, remain silent and accept the existing neo-fascist order under General El-Sisi, or two, contemplate joining some utopian, radical, revolutionary project that might offer the promise of political change. And the one radical, utopian, radical, revolutionary project that is getting a lot of attention is ISIS. There is no third alternative. And tales that we have been receiving, that have been reported from inside Egyptian prisons, leave a lot of cause for concern. People who've come out of the Egyptian prison system have reported that there are internal prisoner debates between different factions within the Egyptian prison system. And the one faction that is winning those debates are the ISIS supporters. And what happens, and what's been reported, is the ISIS supporters walk around the prison system with their chests pumped out very confidently, and they point to the Muslim Brotherhood prisoners, and they say, "You stupid idiots. Look what you did to yourself and to this country. You thought that democracy would work. You thought that elections would work. You thought the West would come to your rescue. You started to talk about rights and the Constitution. Look what happened when the coup d'etat took place. Nothing, no one came to your rescue. You're all rotting now in this prison system. The only option left is to join our radical revolutionary project of political change." And the people who are watching this debate taking place, according to reports that we have, are all silent. The Muslim Brotherhoods can't respond. What are they going to say? And it's ISIS and radical Salafi jihadis who are winning those debates for reasons that are completely rational. Tunisia provides the alternative example. It's the one country where you did have a successful democratic transition, and it's an alternative model to Egypt. Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of Ennahda, has observed that the only way to defeat ISIS is to offer a better product to the millions of young Muslim people, young Muslim men and women in the world. It is called Muslim democracy. He noted that most young people don't like ISIS. See how many millions flee from it. But they won't accept life under tyrants either. This better product must be a political system that is democratic, that respects human rights, and that gives Islamic values some political space. And so it's not a coincidence that ISIS has emerged in the region, attracting new followers after the crushing of the Arab Spring, highlighting the relationship between democratization and violence. And I think the simplest and most articulate formulation of this relationship between democratization and violence was given approximately 55 years ago by then President John F. Kennedy, who famously noted that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And to just test it, you can see the case of Syria. In Syria, in the first year of the uprising against the House of Assad in 2011, there was no ISIS. There was no Al-Qaeda. There were no radical jihadis. There were citizens from different sectarian backgrounds demanding peaceful political change from an authoritarian regime. But as a direct result of the crackdown, as a direct result of the closing of the prospects for peaceful political change, the conflict in Syria moves from a nonviolent peaceful uprising, it gradually becomes militarized, and then it becomes radicalized. But there's more to the ISIS story than what I've said. There's the question of the ideological underpinnings of the ISIS crisis that deserves some attention. And a big part of the ISIS crisis is related to the development and the mainstreaming of a particular toxic interpretation of Sunni Islam that is deeply sectarian, violent. It's an interpretation of Islam that is fundamentally anti-women, anti-minority, deeply intolerant, and supports and legitimates the use of violence toward alternative interpretations and practices of Islam. The roots of this trend, the roots of this development of this particularly toxic form of Sunni Islam is fairly recent in the history of the Islamic world. But it has reached a critical mass and became and has gone mainstream in the Sunni Islamic world during the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. UCLA Islamic studies scholar Khalid Abu al-Fadl has described this phenomenon as, quote, the rise of a culture of ugliness in modern Islam. It is this culture of ugliness, which he emphasizes is a recent development in Muslim societies, that continues to be the single most important obstacle to articulating reasonable narratives of the legitimate possibility of Islam's contribution to human goodness. The dissemination and the proliferation of this extremist, puritanical, and ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam has its roots ideologically in the internal policies of one particular country in the Middle East, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, when ISIS emerges in the summer of 2014, it shocked the West largely because of its extreme brutality, and specifically because, if you remember, there was a series of beheadings that took place of Western hostages. This was in the late summer of 2014. At the exact same time when these Western hostages were being beheaded, in the exact same part of the Middle East, there were other beheadings that were taking place that received almost no media coverage. Around the same time that these 5 Western hostages were beheaded by ISIS, about 4 times as many people were beheaded in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Human rights groups report that in the year 2014, 83 people were beheaded in Saudi Arabia. In November 2015, Amnesty International says that executions in Saudi Arabia are at a 20-year high. And just a few days ago, Human Rights Watch revealed that in 2016 already, 106 people have been executed in Saudi Arabia. Now, all of this sort of draws one's attention to the fact that the more that you look at the internal practices and policies of ISIS in terms of state-society relations, in terms of their views of women, in terms of their views of religious minorities, the more you start to see parallels with Saudi Arabia. So, for example, when ISIS establishes its so-called Islamic State, it needs textbooks in its schools to teach its children. Where does it go? They go on the internet and they download textbooks from the Ministry of Education from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and they start using them in their schools. Why? Because theologically speaking, the Wahhabi underpinnings of the ISIS worldview comes pretty close to the type of Islam that has been taught and preached in Saudi Arabia for many years. And what's so interesting, if you look at, again, state-society relations, I'm not sure if you can see that graph, but in terms of the crime and punishment provisions that exist in ISIS-controlled areas, and the crime and punishment provisions that exist in Saudi Arabia for various crimes, such as murder, treason, etc., they're almost identical. They're almost identical. If you want to email me, I can send you that particular table, but there's quite a bit of parallel, and that's not a coincidence. That's not accidental. And what's interesting is that the ISIS human rights violations invoke hysteria and panic in the West, but these practices that have been taking place in Saudi Arabia for a very long time invoke very little reaction and response. And so this cartoon sort of summarizes the difference. Now, with respect to the question of Saudi Arabia and ISIS and the similarities, it's important to appreciate there's a lot of similarities, but there's also significant differences. The underlying theological interpretation of ISIS and Wahhabi Islam in Saudi Arabia are almost identical. But the difference is that politically speaking, there is a different vision for how the future should look like. In the case of Saudi Arabia, Wahhabi Islam preaches deference to the monarch. It supports the existence of monarchs. The ISIS interpretation of Wahhabi Islam rejects that notion and wants to tear down existing political states and overthrow existing political regimes and form an Islamic caliphate or khalifa in its place. That's the big difference between Saudi Arabia and ISIS. But the theological interpretation and the roots of that ideas go back to the same country and the same theological schools of thought. But of course, the question of Saudi Arabia is important, and its connection to Wahhabism is important, because this is not simply a problem of Saudi Arabia and of the Middle East in and of itself. As a result of the marriage between Wahhabi Islam in Saudi Arabia and Saudi petrodollars, this particular interpretation of Islam, over the course of the last 50 years, has gone global, and it has gone mainstream. And many people today in the Muslim world are unaware of how their alleged authentic interpretation of Islam is deeply infused by these Saudi Wahhabi underpinnings. And so according to one study of one Muslim community in Birmingham, England, 80% of the books in the Muslim community in Birmingham, England that were studied revealed deep Salafi and Wahhabi underpinnings. If you look at many of the terrorist attacks that have shocked the world, particularly in the United States, the Boston bombings in 2013, the Paris and Belgian bombings and attacks, the San Bernardino attacks, if you go through it and you examine it, there is a distinct link to Saudi Wahhabi teachings and practices that inform this particular behavior. And so just moving forward, the problem here with respect to Saudi Arabia and Wahhabi teaching is that Saudi Arabia is a local ally of the West. And Saudi Arabia is a local ally of the West because of economic relationships. Over the last year, the United States of America sold Saudi Arabia and its allies $33 billion in weapons. And when you talk about this in the United States, as they often do, people are perplexed. Because on the one hand, they realize there's something very deeply problematic about Saudi Arabia in terms of the ideology and how it's exporting this. But on the other hand, Saudi Arabia is an economic friend and ally. And so what do you do about this situation? And the inability for Americans to deal with this situation is an ongoing problem that no one in the United States has figured out. But with respect to the question of ISIS, there is this deep problem that can no longer be, I think, ignored. And in summary, it's due to the puritanical, idealized, and thoroughly mythologized view of the past, where Wahhabi Islam cannot reconcile its theological orientation with the complexity and diversity of cultures that constitute our modern world. And as a result of Wahhabi influence, this has added a dimension of oppressiveness and vehemence to contemporary Muslim life that frequently borders on the morbid. And this partially explains why, I think, you have, in some Muslim communities in the West, young kids who are captured by this particular interpretation of Islam. Because when they hear the ISIS preachers and they hear the ISIS rhetoric, it starts to sound familiar, because that's the type of teaching that they have been exposed to. Not exactly, but that's sort of the conveyor belt that they have been put on with respect to this particular interpretation of Islam. And so an ethical interpretation of Islam, a more humanistic interpretation of Islam, an interpretation of Islam that you can reconcile with human rights and democracy, those are interpretations that exist, but they're very few and far between. So if you're a young person growing up anywhere in the Muslim world today, the likelihood that you're going to be exposed to a Salafi Wahhabi interpretation of Islam is huge. The likelihood that you're going to be exposed to a more ethical and humanistic interpretation of Islam is very little. And this is a big problem. So getting to an end now, let me just make a few closing remarks. The crisis that the Arab Islamic world is now facing was actually predictable and was to be expected. 14 years ago, in a series of UN Arab Human Development reports, they actually forecast the deep crisis that was facing the region, hinting at a coming explosion, starting with their 2003. These reports concluded that the Arab world is at a crossroads, and that the region is hampered by three key deficits that are considered to be defining features of the Arab world. Number one, a freedom deficit. Number two, a women's empowerment deficit. And number three, a knowledge deficit. Compared with the rest of the world, the Arab countries had the lowest freedom scores in the 1990s when measured by indicators such as political processes, civil liberties, political rights, and a free media. Similarly, in terms of the status of women, the Arab Human Development Report of 2002 revealed that when you apply the UN gender empowerment measure to Arab countries, this region of the world suffers from a glaring deficit of women's empowerment, and among the regions of the world, it's at the bottom. Only sub-Saharan Africa had a lower score. In the 2004 report, focusing on the theme of freedom, good governance, and political reform, the report documented and concluded that themes that are related to good governance, such as civil and political rights, political participation, representative institutions, political accountability of leadership, the existence of the rule of law, equality of treatment under the law, an independent judiciary, all of these were in short supply. And so let me end now with a comment from one of my favorite intellectuals who studies and writes about the Arab world, the veteran journalist and commentator Rami Nouri. When ISIS emerged in 2014, he had the following words today. Even though they're 2 years old, I still think they have enduring value, and they're worth quoting in full. He said 2 years ago, "In my 45 years in the Arab world, observing and writing about the conditions on the ground, the only thing that surprises me now is why such extremist phenomena that have caused the catastrophic collapse of existing states did not happen earlier. At least since around 1970, the average Arab citizen has lived in political, economic, and social systems that have offered zero accountability, political rights, and participation. States have been characterized by steadily expanding dysfunction and corruption. Economic disparities have driven majorities of people into chronic poverty and humiliating inaction." And then he goes on to state that the existing corrupt, authoritarian political order in the Arab world is to be blamed. This authoritarian order has virtually banned the development of one's full potential in terms of intellect, creativity, public participation, culture, and identity. The Islamic State phenomenon is the latest and perhaps not the final stop on a journey of mass Arab humiliation and dehumanization that has been primarily managed by the Arab autocratic regimes that revolve around single families or clans with immense continuing support from foreign patrons. Foreign military attacks in Arab countries, such as the Iraq War, have exacerbated this trend, as has Israel's aggression against the Palestinian people. But the single biggest driver of the kind of criminal Islamist extremism we see today in this phenomenon is this predicament of several hundreds of millions of individual Arab men and women who find that generation after generation in their own societies they're unable to achieve their full humanity or potential or exercise their full powers of thought and creativity, or in many cases simply obtain the basic necessities of life for themselves and their families. There is only one antidote in the long run to eliminating the Islamic State and all that it represents. and that is to stop pursuing the abusive and criminal policies that have demeaned millions of decent Arab men and women and shaped Arab countries for the past half-century. Bombing Iraq and Syria will gain some time and probably must happen in a combination with serious military action by local Arab and Kurdish forces. However, if the ways of the corrupt modern Arab security state is not radically reversed, the mass desperation and hysteria that the Islamic State represents will only reemerge again in more extreme forms in the years to come. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Nader Hashemi, for that enlightening lectures. I'm sure that the audience will have questions for you after such quite an engaging topic today. But I would like to use my moderator's privilege to start off some questions today. So I can see that one of the recurring themes in your talk is radicalization. What are the circumstances or what are the situations which allow for this extremism to happen? And one of the things that you point out is it had to happen when you force some people to a certain situation where they had no choice but to be radicalized. And I want to kind of bring us to a local example here because this is what happened in Malaysia. Last month, I think, recently, no less than a state mufti in the state of Pahang, one of the 13 states in Malaysia, the state mufti actually said that, and I quote, we should wage war against those who oppose Islam. And he did not mention it directly, but he hinted at one political party in particular. And it was quite a major, I would say, a major story among the press and also in the social media. And when people kind of press him on that, waging war against those who oppose Islam, he kind of backtracked about, oh no, look, I don't really mean that, but he did not retract that statement. But when you look in the context of ISIS, radicalization and extremism, would you be concerned that a state mufti with such remarks, would he kind of make some people at the bottom feel that you know what, maybe it is halal to because extra constitutional means against those who oppose Islam and the implementation of Islamic law in the country? What would you think?
Radicalization happens, I think, for many reasons, largely because groups of people feel insecure, they feel vulnerable, they feel fearful that their future is uncertain. But of course, it takes on a new level in a much more a different dimension when leaders, whether religious or political, legitimize the fear and insecurity that people have in terms of the use of violence. So, and particularly when it's legitimated in the framing of an alleged ethical framework such as Islam, where you have a religious authority figure making these comments. So there's a parallel here in terms of what's happening in the United States. I'm not saying an exact parallel, but the reason why there has been an upsurge, for example, in Islamophobia in the United States is because you have leading politicians, in this case Donald Trump, who wants to become president, who's openly stating these things. Which is why, if you look at the opinion polls, these views are now given legitimacy before they're on the margins. So, we don't need to sort of, I think, diminish the conversation or reduce it to simply this particular cleric who is making these types of extremist statements. I don't want to mention any names, but you do have examples where political leaders in different parts of the world have pointed to ISIS and suggested that they need to be honored and valued because of their courage and because of their heroism. And so you get into a problem here when it's not just religious leaders, but you have political leaders who are sort of indirectly or coming very close to saying that, you know, the ISIS extremist religious cult has some value that we need to emulate. So this is a problem. When leaders legitimate and give a voice to this type of behavior, then it's open season. Then people sort of will start to take, I think, the law into their own hands, and that's when you get, you know, the serious threat of sort of violence and political breakdown and instability and disorder.
Okay, so I think we can take like 2 or 3 questions at one round, and then maybe Doctor can respond to the questions. So we have like extra mic for the audience. All right, yeah. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you can, you know, grab the mic and ask your questions.
Dr. Hashemi, good evening. I'm Philip and I'm just a concerned citizen. I'm concerned not only because of the things that you described to us all over the world, but I see a manifestation of like trends happening in our very society. Now, my question to you is, you have presented Tunis as a possible model, a possible positive model for Muslim democracy to move forward on. And on the other hand, you have also correctly, in my opinion, I've held this for a long time myself, identified the root cause of radicalization, the fundamental foundation of radicalization to be from Wahhabi curriculum, which has infested religious schools all over the world, including Malaysia and its hinterland sekolah pondok, village madrasas. So, under such a woeful scenario, how do you think the Tunisian model could somehow be leveraged to offset this insidious Wahhabi influence that's now infesting the world? Thank you.
The Tunisian model is interesting, but there's several things that are happening in Tunisia that might make some people in this room pause for a moment. Generally speaking, with respect to your question, let me address that. The Tunisian model suggests that you have a transition to democracy where you have open societies where people can have debates. People can stand up, and if they don't like, for example, a Wahhabi preacher, they can openly sort of criticize it without fear of retribution from the state, without fear of their newspaper being censored or their website being shut down. So the hope is that in the context of a transition to democracy, you can have an exchange of views, and if someone is going to offer a Wahhabi interpretation of Islam in some mosques, well then there will be an opportunity for freedom of organization and mobilization for people to offer an alternative interpretation, and so that over the course of time, the more enlightened ethical views will start to dominate. But of course, that's over the long term. What's interesting about Tunisia is it has achieved very high scores for democratic transition. But what people don't know about Tunisia is also Tunisia has produced the highest number of recruits for ISIS. So we're getting 2 messages. How do we explain it? One, I think it's the point that I just mentioned, the question of the long-term survivability of democracy, where you start to see a diminishing of radicalization. But the reason why you have these number of recruits, that large numbers of them that are leaving Tunisia and going to ISIS, is because, number one, this legacy of authoritarianism is still affecting Tunisian society. You know, people don't go from an authoritarian political order to democratic one overnight and start to behave very differently. The other thing is the socioeconomic underpinnings of radicalization and despair and hope. In the case of Tunisia, there has been a transition to democracy and a very liberal democratic constitution that's been written. But if you go to the countryside, if you go to the smaller towns and villages, there's economic despair. And I've been to Tunisia several times, and if you talk to people in the rural areas, they say, look, everyone is talking about these debates about a constitution and which article can guarantee us the maximum amount of freedom and liberties and rights and make sure it's reconciled with democracy. But we have no jobs. We're unemployed. Tourists aren't coming anymore. If you're a young person, the unemployment rate in Tunisia is over 40%. You have nothing to do. And then you have, because the old authoritarian order has crumbled, and Tunisia now is an open society, you have an influx of Salafi Wahhabi preachers. According to some reports that I've seen, 80% of the mosques, because it's open now, are controlled by these Salafi Wahhabi preachers who have ties to Gulf money, who have satellite dishes, and they feed on a particular narrative that is black and white, and it convinces people who are looking for answers. So some of these young people are then recruited. So the challenge of Tunisia really is you not only need a democratic transition, you need an open society, but you also need strong economic incentives in society. And you also need, I think, a much more sophisticated and effective ground game to challenge this radical Salafi Wahhabi worldview that is now taking over the Islamic world. And that requires a lot of sophisticated, I think, strategizing, because these Salafi preachers come and they say, there's only one correct interpretation of Islam, and it's the one that I'm articulating. And everyone else is a deviant Muslim, a liberal Muslim, an inauthentic Muslim. And they have a lot of resources. But also, these Salafi Wahhabi preachers have an effective ground game. They're organically connected. They have a network of people who can penetrate society, and they offer sometimes social services. So unless you are willing and able to do that as well, have an effective grassroots ground game to sort of start to, and also I would argue, one way of challenging Salafi Wahhabi Islam, and this hasn't been thought of, you need to have Muslim clerics and Muslim imams who also have gone and undertaken the sufficient amount of training to be considered a proper alim or cleric, but have a more ethical interpretation. If all of the preachers who go to Saudi Arabia or go to Al-Azhar come back and they're preaching this form of intolerant, ultra-conservative, puritanical Islam, it's going to be a problem because they're going to seem like they're authentic Muslims. You need also, for lack of a better term, ethical imams, ethical preachers who can also produce interpretations of Islam that are considered authentic and that can lead to a better vision for society such as Malaysia that's tolerant, that's inclusive, that's democratic, and that respects human rights.
All right. Do we have another questions from the floor? Oh, yeah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good evening to you. I feel very cold because I'm sitting directly under the aircon. I hope to warm myself up. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful academic scenario that you gave to us about the topic. My name is Haji Ahmad Nazar. I'm from University of Science Malaysia, and my PhD is on terrorism. That is why I felt that I should not miss this. So since terrorism is my food, my plate of food, a cup of drink, I totally disagree with you on many things. I would love to have a debate with you, but my due respect is because you gave a lot of points. And the first thing that I will dispute with you is, please do not use the word ISIS. It's a state. Daesh is the name of that organization. It is the Americans and the West, they created this word called ISIS. It will start off with ISIS, and I'm not lecturing you, you seem to have a good knowledge on it. Islamic State of Syria, Iraq, and the Levant. That's how it starts. They wanted to create that state. What state is it? That is the state that the West destroyed before by colonialism. Remember, that's the whole thing will come back to that. Daesh wants to go back to where they were before the West, after Westphalia and before colonialism. The West created it. So they wanted to go back. That's what they want. We want to create back that Arab nation. You created Syria. You created Iraq. You created all this. It's the West. We don't want all that. We want to go back to the Middle East. So you use the word Daesh. Don't use IS. IS is a state. You cannot call an organization Islamic State. It's not Islamic State. It is Daesh. And Daesh has been there before Daesh, they gave the name Daesh because of the stubborn people. Daesh, go away. So that's how it starts. So please try not to use the word ISIL or ISIS or IS. It's the name of a state. They want to create that state. The next thing is, you are looking, I understand you, but I look at it from a different angle. I think it's good for us. You are looking at one angle. I am looking from a different angle. This was created by the Western invasion of Iraq. I'm not anti-American, I'm pro-American. I ate American food, so I'm very pro-American. People were wondering, what do you mean by ate American food? When I was a kid, I was on poverty. So they used to give this food, milk, corn, and a few things, and it was written there, donated by the peoples of the United States of America. I can still remember carrying, so I don't want to be a traitor. But you invaded Iraq. Beautiful. You wanted to throw away a dictator. You banned the Baas party. Good. That was his party. But you dismantled an army. You disbanded the police. You disbanded security. Who is going to look after them? It went into chaos. Then the other governments, that Maliki and all, take away. It's called corrupted police. So who created this? You left a vacuum. And these guys, the Shia takes over, the Sunnis go to the north. You must understand, they're all well-trained army guys, generals. So they take over the arms. And they come from the north, Mosul. They say, we want to create ISIL, ISIS. So that, it's just a little because I was too cold there. So I'm just getting myself warmed up.
Brother, do you have a question?
No, I have no question. I just want to say that I differ with you in many things. I don't know if I have any question because...
Okay, could I respond to what you've said?
No, I'll finish. Because I want to finish it all and stop. And then, you see, for instance, you should have looked at it, you should look at that angle. This was created by the West. They just left like that. Now you're all fighting with each other. Secondly, you're talking about Saudi Arabia. Who backed Saudi Arabia? Who funded Saudi Arabia? Who made Saudi Arabia such a powerful country that could do all this? Not the Arabs themselves. You go back to the 60s, you go back to the 60s. Who was the best? I was in Saudi Arabia. One guy told me, we have two gods. Huh? You have two gods, you're Muslim. One is Allah, the other one is America. The way they look at it. So you guys have already created all kinds of dangerous guys. Saddam Hussein was funded.
Sir, do please keep your comment short.
Okay. Finally, actually the basic principle in terrorism is human security. Where there is absence of human security, you have all these problems. There's no political security. There's no economic security. There's no social security. There's no religious security. You have seeds for terrorism, not any other reason. Anyway, finally, somebody mentioned about Malaysia. Don't bother about all these muftis. These are crazy guys. This is a beautiful, moderate country. One guy making a statement doesn't mean that other Muslims like me are against. We are all moderate. We'll always tolerate you. We have lived in this country peacefully. We'll never be. Just ignore these guys now. Anyway, sorry, Mr. Hashemi, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't want to ridicule you. I just wanted to express what I felt. Anyway, thank you very much for some of the great information that you gave me. And if I've taken some of your time and I've offended anybody here, please forgive me. I just wanted to I was feeling too cold, so I wanted to warm myself up. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. In fact, I completely agree with the last point that you made, that the fundamental problem here is human security. And that's at the root of the crisis that leads to terrorism and insecurity. In terms of your two other points, whether we should call it ISIS or call them the Islamic State, I'm not interested in getting to a debate on semantics. I think whether you call it IS or Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, what's much more important is what this group represents, what type of vision they have for the future, and what their roots are. And I think if we can get to those topics, then we'll be able to understand this particular phenomenon at a greater level and with greater insight.
Sir, the one at the back.
I just have a very quick question here. based on what I've been listening so far, I perceive that actually our problem is actually ideological in that sense. It's actually a clash of narratives. A narrative that is offered by Wahhabism and which has been hijacked by Daesh is that you guys, your other ways have failed. The West have, the solutions by the West, democracy have failed. The only way is the Islamic State. And it's utopia, you know. Even our Sharia will prevent crime, etc., etc., etc. That's the sort of narrative, that's the sort of vision that they have lured both young and old to their ranks. My question is, how does the moderate Muslim community now, horrified at all this, be able to offer an alternative narrative which is also solidly theologically based to combat this? Thank you.
Alright, we'll take 3 questions at a time so that it'll be easier for Prof to answer, like we have limited time. And do please keep your comments or questions short. Fikri and then the one in the back.
Thank you. Closer? Okay. I want to say I found it really, really interesting, but I have one question. So we're talking about this emergence of this group, IS, Daesh, Islamic State. We're talking about how we are going to stop it. But let's consider it gets influence internationally. Let's say, okay, we're going to stop, they say we're going to stop every brutality, or let's go around the table. How do you think, what do you see the chances of a succeeding IS if they could get the chance? Is there hope? If so, if they say, okay, let's get around the table, let's stop.
Is your question, is there a chance of negotiating with ISIS?
No, if you just look at,
Is that your question?
No, if you just look at the group IS, or the Islamic State, if they get this state internationally, what's the future for the group? Do you think they could manage to be a stable country? Thank you.
Or just these two?
Yeah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My question is, how is Wahhabism can be linked with ISIS? Because Wahhabism, their root was from one scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. Because even in our textbooks, in Malaysian textbooks, the concept of oneness of God, the Tauhid, Uluhiyah, Rububiyyah, Asma wa Sifat, which we all learned, was in our textbook. Even Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, many scholars have praised him. Like Sheikh Dr. Yusuf Al-Qaradawi said he was a mujaddid. Even other scholars like Dr. Wahab Az-Zahidi, he was a moderate scholar. He is the one who said in his book that the word kafir harbilah, some of the mufti are saying, was irrelevant. He is the one also praised Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. How can Ibn Taymiyyah from Wahhabism to Ibn Taymiyyah? Then they said they are the Hanabilah, the Hanbali school. How this can be linked?
So your question, what's your question precisely? Could you just articulate what you said in a question?
Yeah, how to link Wahhabism with Ibn Taymiyyah? Because Ibn Taymiyyah said, Az-Zahabi said this in Siyar al-Nubala, whosoever consider Hadith Qiblah his prey, I cannot consider them as kafir.
Right. I get it. Okay, let me take your question first. Look, in the intellectual architecture of what we refer to as Wahhabi Islam, there obviously are Islamic themes that are very familiar and very authentic to most believing Muslims. Okay? So when, for example, Wahhabi Islam emphasizes the theme of Tawheed, the oneness of God, this is foundational to every Muslim. But of course, there's other things that flow out of Wahhabi Islam that starts to veer into a very dangerous direction. So when Wahhabi Islam, or when Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab sort of starts saying that we can only understand Islam in one way. And anyone who has perhaps a different opinion, a different interpretation, a different understanding of Tawheed, well then you're a kuffar. You have to be silenced. And you have to be silenced through force. And the problem with Ibn Abdul Wahhab and his teachings that have now gone global is that I would argue they have fundamentally corrupted and violated a very important Islamic norm that the classical juridical scholars who formed the very rich part of Islamic jurisprudential thinking were very much in agreement on. If you look at the classical juridical tradition and the scholars who defined what we understand today to be Islamic jurisprudence, there was always an agreement among all of the scholars that whatever interpretation I might have about a political or social issue, it's an individual human's interpretation to approximate and understand God's will. No one can understand and have the final interpretation and claim that only my interpretation is the correct one. Because if you say that, then you're claiming that you know God or perhaps are God, and that's considered to be shirk. So there was a sense in the deep debates that whatever interpretation people will have, that it was limited. It was the best attempt by an authentic scholar to understand a political problem. And there was always a sense of humility, a sense of, I don't have the final answer. The final answer will be revealed by God in the day after. So in that sense, there was a sense of respect and tolerance that people could differ among themselves, have different interpretations, and there wouldn't be violence, there wouldn't be repression, there wouldn't be attempt to execute people. But with the Wahhabi teaching of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, drawing upon Ibn Taymiyyah and drawing upon his own interpretation, you have a big divergence that takes place, a deep intolerance. That people who have a different interpretation aren't legitimate. There's only one interpretation. And if you don't agree with the interpretation, then you either have to leave, or if you don't leave, you have to be silenced, and if you don't stay silent, you can be repressed and even killed. That's where the problem emerges. And that's a fundamental corrupting of Islam's ethical and humanistic tradition, and it's also corrupting of the great classical jurisprudential debates that once dominated the Muslim world, and unfortunately today many Muslims have forgotten the tradition. The second question with respect to what would happen with respect to ISIS if it consolidates control? What type of state will it be? What will the consequences of that be? Well, I think if ISIS is able to stand the onslaught and establish and consolidate its Islamic state, then I think you're going to first and foremost see more of the same in terms of how it treats its own society. One of the distinguishing characteristics of ISIS is its extreme, brutal, repressive nature toward its own citizens, toward women, toward minorities, the brutality and the execution and the valorization and the celebration of this gross violence in the name of Islam is such a bastardization of Islamic tradition that it's completely shocking. As a Muslim, I just don't know where this interpretation comes from. So last week in France, a bunch of militant young kids claiming and holding up the ISIS flag, and then these people were celebrated by ISIS, go into a church in France and go to the priest and slit his throat and say they're doing it in the name of Islam. It's just so shocking that this type of interpretation is connected to anything that has to do with Islam, that one can only hope that what ISIS stands for and represents can be defeated and rolled back in some way. Because if it's allowed to continue, we're going to see more of these types of practices and behaviors that will fundamentally destabilize the region. So this is what we're in for if ISIS is able to survive. It's a catastrophe. And what's so catastrophic about it, it also legitimizes these behaviors in the minds of some confused Muslims in other parts of the world, because they think, well look, ISIS is standing for this model, and look what they're doing to, let's say, the Yazidi minority, look what they're doing to women, look what they're doing to Shia. Well, we can do the same thing in our part of the world, and we'll call it Islamic. And we'll be rewarded, allegedly, in the hereafter. And so the fact that you have this existing model alive and perpetuating itself is a deep problem, because it acts as a supposed model, for some people who are confused, but also much more importantly, in terms of the question of terrorism. The attacks in Paris and in Brussels last year, we now know, were orchestrated, organized, planned, and financed from within ISIS territory. The fact that this group has existed for 2.5 years, can recruit people, train them, and send them back to Europe, is one reason why we're having these ISIS attacks in different parts of the world. Not all the attacks are ISIS organized, many of them are ISIS inspired, but the ones that are organized, particularly the ones in France in late November of 2015, are directly a result of this group's existence. And so the longer it exists, the more you're going to have these types of massacres, and the more you're going to have the consequences that flow from that. So in the case of Europe, these right-wing parties, Le Pen, are benefiting from this. They're saying, look, this is what happens when you allow Muslims to immigrate here. And so it perpetuates a cycle where societies start to become polarized. And you have people like Donald Trump. Donald Trump, every time there's a massacre, he says, see, I told you so, we have to ban all the Muslims. And so this is one of the negative consequences if ISIS continues to survive.
And there was the earlier question about the ideological challenge that Wahhabi Islam.
It's an ideological challenge. One of the challenges is you have to provide alternative interpretations. If you're a young person growing up and all that you hear is a Wahhabi interpretation, you're going to gravitate to that. Life is about options, it's about choices. And if the only choice you have is one item on the menu, you're going to consume that. But it's not simply an ideological choice. In the context of the Middle East today, the one reason why ISIS and the Wahhabi interpretation is so popular is because it is connected to a certain political reality. A political reality where you have brutalized populations, repressive states, no option for young people to organize, to mobilize, to be politically active, to write an op-ed. You have complete people who are frustrated. And so some people think that the only thing that they can do with their lives is to engage in some sort of brutal act of terrorism or violence. So a lot of Americans, I have to remind them that on September the 11th, 2001, 19 hijackers attacked the United States. Among those 19 hijackers, 15 of them came from one country, Saudi Arabia. And these were not the poorest of the poor, the most oppressed. They were relatively middle class and they were relatively educated. And so it poses the question, what was going on in the mind of these 15 young people who thought that the best way they could spend their lives on this earth is to engage in that type of suicidal operation? And the answer to the question has to do with the internal politics of Saudi Arabia. No opportunity for freedom of thought, for expression, a Wahhabi interpretation that has gone radical and that justifies these acts of violence. So it's not just the ideas. Yes, the idea is important, but if those more ethical interpretations of Islam can't find a home and can't have the freedom to, interact with people, then you're going to get the more radical interpretations that are going to rise to the top.
Okay, we're gonna go for one final round of questioning. So if we can have just one more question from the floor, and I have one final question here. Okay, we can take two since you have two hands up. You and you. Please keep your question short.
Good evening, Dr. Nader. My name is Dinesh Kumar. I'm a political science undergraduate from University of Science Malaysia. I would like to ask a question regarding education. If when we talk about terrorists, we assume that these people are mostly from low income family background, they're extremely poor, they have very low education, and usually these kind of people are the ones who can be easily recruited into terrorist network. But years after years have gone by, and we have seen that well-educated people, even professionals, are slowly getting recruited into these terror networks. So my question is, if education can prevent poor people from indulging into terrorism, then what about these professionals? What can we do to change their minds to reject extremism? That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Lee.
Good afternoon, Doctor. My name is Lee. I'm a concerned Malaysian. So I'd like to ask a question. So in responding to the entire scenario of terrorist activities and the counter-terrorism movement in the world, how do you perceive the thesis of Samuel Huntington's on the clash of civilization. Would you agree that actually all of this phenomenon is a realization of his thesis? Thank you.
Okay, Prof, I have one final question.
Sure.
So in your talk, you kind of mentioned a lot about radicalization because arises out of they don't have freedom and opportunity to do what they want. So, but it's a little bit more nuanced there, isn't it? Like, can you allow some people, some groups to implement undemocratic laws through democratic means? For example, we have the Voodoo Bill here in Malaysia, and in Indonesia they have the Sharia law in Aceh. Can you imagine if the Indonesian government doesn't allow Aceh to implement that Sharia law? So you might imagine today that the people in Daesh or ISIS, they would radicalize these people into implementing an attack on the Indonesian national government. So how do you reconcile that? An undemocratic law passing through democratic means, and if you don't allow that, you might just radicalize them. So how do you do that?
Now that's a good question. That's a big tension because, on the one hand, if you believe in the principle of self-determination, that people are allowed to determine their own affairs, what do you do when you have a situation where the majority of people want a particular interpretation of law and they win elections? The way that this is resolved in the course of the history and the practice of democracy is that you develop a situation where democracy does not mean majoritarianism. That people who come to power in a democratic society, they can win elections, but they have to work within the framework of the law, within the framework of an existing constitution. And most democratic constitutions have this set of provisions known as, in the United States, the Bill of Rights, or in Canada, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which democratic majorities cannot easily repeal or work against. And then you have an independent judiciary that, at least theoretically, is supposed to be independent from the executive, that implements and interprets the law. So that's historically how these things have sort of emerged, at least in the West. In the case of Muslim societies, you have, I think, a bigger challenge because you have these constituencies that are in favor of interpretations of law that many of us would find fundamentally unethical and problematic. So what do you do when they have a base of support? I think you have to do many things. One thing, you have to try and challenge those interpretations in the court of public opinion. You have to try and rely on the legal framework. That's why in the course of the development of democracy, constitution writing is so important. Because a constitution is supposed to lay out the blueprints of how you resolve these tensions in terms of majoritarianism and basic rights that can't be abridged by popular votes. Which is, so that's important. So what do you do today in the context of Aceh or in the context of Malaysia, where they want to bring in these Hudud ordinances in the name of Islamic authenticity? Well, you would hope that there would be an independent judiciary that could sort of implement and provide a judgment in terms of how far you can go to pass new laws that might be in conflict with the existing constitution. Now, if you don't have an independent judiciary, then you have a big problem here. And this speaks to, I think, the fundamental need to get your democratic house in order. So you do have an independent judiciary that is fully independent, and the executive respects that. But I think there's no avoiding the challenge of trying to win the battles of hearts and minds into the realms of ideas. If people think that bringing Hudud ordinance is going to lead to a more just society, then you have to try and challenge that argument. Anywhere you've had Hudud ordinances implemented, I just ask yourself, would you like to live under one of those societies? Is the Islamic Republic of Iran a model? Is the Taliban a model? Is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia a model? Is ISIS or Islamic State or Daesh a model? Is Aceh province an example of a just and flourishing society? Some people might agree with that. So these are the arguments that you have to have. The challenge, I think, for Muslims is those people who are in favor of Hudud ordinances are sort of saying, look, there's only one way to be a Muslim here. And you have to have a literal interpretation of these laws, and you have to try and implement them. The challenge is to try and focus on fundamental values,
fundamental, more ethical interpretations and push back against this, but then also relying on a legal framework that might be able to work to your benefit. Now, with respect to this thesis on the clash of civilizations, thesis, how many people here, first of all, know what the clash of civilizations thesis is as articulated by Samuel Huntington? One person knows. Two people know. Okay, so let me just give you a brief overview of the thesis. After the end of the Cold War, in the early 1990s, Samuel Huntington, distinguished professor at Harvard University, prominent political scientist, writes this essay, and then it comes out into a book called The Clash of Civilizations. And he says that now that the Cold War is over, the world will not be divided between communist East and capitalist West. International relations now will be divided and driven by clashing civilizations, fundamentally rooted in different religious interpretations of this civilization, of these civilizations. And he basically said it's going to be the West against the rest. And the rest being the Islamic world in perhaps some sort of alliance with China. And this will shape and drive civilizational, international relations. Now, a lot of people took a lot of, comfort in that because that's what they sort of wanted to believe. But if you actually look at what's happening in the world today, take, for example, the question of ISIS. So ISIS claims to be, representative of Islamic authenticity and Islamic authenticity. But the overwhelmingly largest number of victims that ISIS is responsible for killing are fellow Muslims. Many Muslims strongly disagree with the ISIS narrative. In fact, when ISIS emerged, there was an open letter to Baghdadi that was published by all of the leading Islamic scholars in the world, point by point, repudiating the teachings of ISIS. So the idea, first of all, with respect to the clash of civilizations thesis, that sort of suggests that there's one Islamic civilization, and it thinks and behaves and breeds in exactly the same way, and there's no debate and difference within that civilization, is, one of the flaws of the thesis. Or, in the case of Western civilization, who represents Western civilization today? Take the United States, where I currently live. Does Donald Trump represent Western civilization? Or does Hillary Clinton? The United States is deeply divided. Does the right-wing nationalist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant groups in Europe represent European civilization? Or does Angela Merkel, who has a different view on these issues? So the problem with the thesis is that when you examine it, it might seem ideologically reassuring and comforting to people for those who already are predisposed to think in those terms. But the thesis, upon examination, breaks down on examination. So when Huntington was writing this thesis, the war in Bosnia was in full swing. And if you remember the war in Bosnia, it was a war where overwhelmingly the perpetrators of that war, responsible for the crime of genocide, were Christian Serbian Orthodox militia, massacring largely Muslim and Croat forces. And it was the Bosnian government, which in the early phases of the war was standing for a multicultural, multi-ethnic, politically secular system where all citizens could live together. And it was the Christian Serbian Orthodox extremist militias who were trying to crush that project. In many ways, it was the reverse of the Huntington thesis. Now, ISIS and some Muslim groups in the Islamic world today do believe in the clash of civilizations. I think within the ISIS worldview, they believe exactly what Huntington is saying. But of course, they believe it in reverse terms, where they think they're the good guys and the West is the bad guys, the reverse of what Huntington was saying. But the problem with the thesis is this fundamental, misunderstanding that somehow civilizations are monolithic, they all think and believe the same thing, and there's no debate within them. There's a big debate right now within the heart of the Muslim world, competing visions, which is something that the Huntington thesis didn't take into account. And the first question that was asked about education and radicalism. You're right to point out that many of these people who go and join radical groups, they're not the poorest of the poor. They're middle class, sometimes they're very well educated. How do we explain that? It seems counterintuitive, but actually it's not. If you look at the history of radical revolutionary movements and protest movements, forget the Islamic world for a second, but in Europe, in the West, it's always been those people who've been middle class, who don't have to worry about working 2 jobs to pay their bills, but they have a certain income comfort zone where they can pursue thinking about political change, that are the drivers of all of these revolutionary movements. Radical left-wing movements, socialist, communist movements, they all come from that strata of society. So that class component, the sort of middle class, the middle class starts thinking about, because they have the opportunity and the luxury, they don't have to worry about putting food on the table. They're thinking about political change. They're thinking about how we can change this world. They have the means to do so. So in that sense, the fact that you're seeing a lot of middle class, relatively educated young people joining ISIS, and it's not the poorest of the poor, is not an aberration. In fact, it's very consistent from what we know of the participants and the demographic backgrounds of people who are involved in utopian revolutionary projects. It's perfectly consistent, and it's not a surprise sociologically speaking.
All right, thank you.